He's a co-founder of Saga, Fort Lauderdale-based engineering firm focused on developing innovative solutions to increasing flood risk from sea level rise and stronger storms. As the director of projects and engineering for the firm, Michael is responsible for the oversight and management of all projects and engineering practices conducted. He also serves as the chair of the Committee on Sustainability and Resilience for the Florida section of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He holds a BS in Civil Engineering and an MS in Coastal Oceanography Engineering from the University of Florida. And today his presentation is entitled Flooded by History, Preserving the Past in a New Era. So let's all welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Tiny Design Preservation League for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Is this working?
You got to talk loud, yeah.
Everyone can hear me? Is this all right? Okay, great. So, again, thank you to the Miami Design Preservation League for having me here today. This is a tough topic. I've heard mentioned before that somebody brought up the idea of these battles where you have to choose one or the other of sea level rise or historic preservation. I do agree with Alan that that's not necessarily the case. There are certainly ways that we can figure out how to marry these two together. But it's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of conversation and a lot of time. So it's a good thing we're here talking about this now because we're going to need as much time as we can. So I'd like to start really by speaking about the goals of all of these projects, of what we're trying to do. And I think this is a really important note to hit because when, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion around some neighborhoods right up the street. And it's very important to recognize where our priorities are. I think everybody has different priorities, everybody has different values, what they find to be most desired for them. And by taking them into context and calling what those are for another, and remembering where we are, that's how we're going to be able to reach common ground. So it seems in a lot of cases that these priorities, the property owners' priorities, preservation's priorities, these are just general. They don't necessarily apply to everyone. But they seem to be in open conflict with each other. Where they come together, however, is everybody wants to find a solution that makes financial sense. We want to minimize the burden on all parties involved to as much, to the extent that's possible. There's going to be a burden in some way, shape, or form. We're dealing with a challenge that humanity's never really faced before. So how we overcome that, there's going to be compromises, there's going to be difficulties. And maximizing the longevity of those communities, of those areas. How do we best preserve the character, the architecture? So what I want to talk about today is kind of just to present a framework that I see for how to approach these discussions rather than developing solutions. And then once we talk about those discussions, we can start focusing a little bit more on what's feasible in the short term and in the midterm while we work collectively towards these long-term goals. So when we think about the long-term goals, and I just want to pose this in, long-term being 50 plus years out, let's say. The long-term option number one is Ellie. Now this photo is from Charleston, South Carolina, and so is the cover photo. I just want to point this out because this is not a problem that's unique to South Florida. It's not unique to Miami Beach. Obviously, Miami Beach is very unique in its own architecture, its own identity, and the fact that we have a porous substrate. But this is something that communities all over the country are dealing with. So when we think about elevation, that's what sea level rise really is. It's a game of elevation. Because of our limestone substrate, it really is the only extreme long-term option. And when I say long-term again, I'm talking 50 plus years out. So we have to think about how we're going to reconfigure at that time. We don't have to get there today. The second long-term option is redevelopment. This is not really an option either because that compromises our character, that compromises the architecture that's so valuable to this community, that defines Miami Beach. So this is really an option either. That's not an option. We all know that that's not an option. So I've heard it said that when you have one option, when you have one choice, you really don't have any choice. When you have two choices, you're faced with a dilemma. And only when you have three choices or more do you actually have an alternative. We're dealing with a situation where we're in a dilemma because we're thinking about redevelopment with elevation, with preservation. We've got to find some happy medium between those two in the very long term. And in order to do that, we have to get very, very, very creative. People recognize this puzzle at all? If you see it, shout it out. Think outside the box. All right, so we've got to think outside the box, and we've got to be ready to compromise. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to talk about Palm View for a moment. In Palm View, one of obviously the most immediate need is the repair of the seawall along the Commons now, right? So that seawall is about 1,700 feet long. It spans about 8 private properties and then has some street ends as well. But that seawall is not just integral to those properties. That seawall is integral to the entire community. So how do we band together as a community to raise that seawall? Is there an option to leverage public dollars? Is there a way we can go about some sort of property assessed financing over a longer period of time, 15, 20 years out, where that is, that's stretched over that kind of time period to make the improvements necessary. And one improvement like that will go a very, very, very long way. In the meantime, we want to focus on protecting the resources that are already there. This image is showing what's called a PESCO barrier. It's something that's used frequently by the Department of Defense. It's not necessarily feasible for communities in Miami Beach because these are designed for very long spans of actually. It's bunched up in a truck almost, and then the truck drives off and it dumps it all out. And it stretches itself, and I think you could, in a 40-foot truck, I think it fits like 200 or 300 plus feet of this type of barrier. But the objective is the same. We need to protect in the short and midterm while we figure out long-term plans. So what does that look like? Physical barriers and stormwater management. We have 3 types of flooding that we're really vulnerable to. That's tidal flooding, storm surge flooding, and rainfall flooding. Sea level rise is just a mechanism that augments those types of flooding. So by figuring out where we can apply these, both at a neighborhood scale and at an individual property level, is going to be critical to figuring out how to increase the longevity. Now, to get into property specific, how many of you are familiar with the concept of dry floodproofing? By show of hands. How many have seen it in practice? Okay. So there are obviously some restrictions on dry floodproofing, particularly with residential properties. And it becomes very challenging, but it is an option and it can be useful. The reason I bring this up is because as time goes on, and it really is one of the most effective ways. It's something that's done tightly to a building envelope. It's something that doesn't require much intervention during the time of a flood. So it's something to consider for sure. And as we move further away from the building, we start getting into these areas of flood walls and other perimeter boundaries. These are essentially just smaller scale versions of seawalls, of things of that nature in order to keep water out. Naturally, they require other components as well to block off any kinds of openings, provide sump pumps to get rid of any rainwater that infiltrates during that time, but they can be cost effective. And I'm bringing these things up just because while we work towards long-term solutions, we've got to consider what we can do in the short and medium term. And I'm going to keep harping on that because this is not an easy discussion. It's not something that we're going to solve overnight or in the next year or probably even in the next 3 years, because there are so many different points of view, so many different challenges that come from this, and so many different areas for compromise. This is another example of a type of perimeter barrier. This has been used successfully in the city of Fort Lauderdale, by the city of Fort Lauderdale. And these are different options that have different applications, right? This is a little bit more effective in areas where you don't want something permanent. This is a temporary system that gets deployed versus the flood wall previously shown, which is a permanent solution. And a perimeter barrier of this nature, a stop log system, this requires substantial operations. This requires substantial personnel to deploy. They manufacture these in simpler systems where it's a single piece. And I'm sure many of you, as you go downtown in the area south of it, you see all the holes in the concrete and everything to handle all those systems. They're not the most, they're not the prettiest, but they're effective. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to move on to the next thing. This is rainwater storage. These are examples of things that can be done on individual properties. It's just taking large-scale public sector infrastructure investments and scaling them down for individual properties. If each property in the neighborhood were able to store 100 gallons or 200 gallons of additional water during a rain event, that could go a very, very long way if everybody gets on board and everybody is able to work together in that common goal. And finally, sea level rise ready. I'm just going to plug this real quick. This is a concept that we developed at Brizaga. The idea of it is to provide a brand for people that are thinking about sea level rise and actually taking action towards mitigating their flood risk. The objective here is not to stamp the property and say this is going to be sea level rise ready for all time, but the idea is to give it a certain timeline. For this, we tend to use 30 years. We want to look at specific metrics of tidal influence above just a mean high or high water. We want to look at the highest high tide that can be expected anywhere in a 30-year period, and whether or not that property is elevated above it, and whether or not it can handle the rainwater and storm surge that comes with it, and whether or not there's a plan in place for dealing with the emergency management side of things. And we just need to remember this. Resilience, the sea level rise issue, we're not going to get there overnight. We're not going to get there in 30 years. We're not going to get there in 50 years. The world is going to be ever changing. Our community is going to be ever evolving. So we've got to just be ready to evaluate those changes, rethink the way we think about preservation, rethink the way we think about development, figure out what's really important to us, and make those decisions together as a community. So that's all I've got today. So thank you very much. All right, thank you. Oh, yes.
The exterior inflatable.
This one?
Yeah, can they be placed inside or can they be outside?
No, inside the building?
Yeah.
No, they're best outside of the building.
What about an apartment?
For an apartment building?
Yeah, for the terraces or...
For terraces, there are other solutions. There's actually a manufacturer that's local that I've been discussing with They've identified some different solutions to prevent, it's what they're calling it is high-frequency floodproofing. So really designed for king tides, designed for something that you need to deploy on a more frequent basis than when a storm is coming. It's basically a foam system, maybe 1 foot deep, and it just comes with a couple latches. And it squeezes into an opening very, very tight.
Okay, inside or outside?
Right in the door frame.
Inside.
Yes.
And what is the cost you
For each unit, I don't know. If it, for like a 6 foot door, maybe it would be about $500. I think they're looking at. It's not quite market ready, but I think that's one of the big keys of this is innovation is starting to outpace the rate of sea level rise, and as long as innovation outpaces the rate of sea level rise, we're going to be able to come up with newer solutions each and every year. And that's really what I want everybody to take away from this is there is a lot of optimism. There is a lot of innovation and technology and investment going into figuring this out because there's too much economic opportunity to throw by the wayside. There's too much culture, there's too much history. It's very rich, and we intend to keep it.